least try to make this an interesting fight.
What's going on, guys? TG or Thundergod here. Today we're doing a bit of like a Konoha crush versus the other hidden villages. I think it'd be an interesting discussion. Now, the way I'm gonna format this kind of video is Orochimaru essentially kind of performs the same maneuver that he did on Hiruzen, where he essentially turns it into a 1v1 against the Kage, with us also discussing how the village forces from each village would stack up to the leaf and kind of paint overall what really would have happened if he tried this on other villages. If you enjoy these videos, consider subscribing or don't. It's a button. I can't control you. I don't got genjutsu like that. But anyway, let's get into it. Now, starting off, I want to talk about Orochimaru, talk about some of the nuance, his strength, all that good stuff, some of his arsenal. Now, I will say, I've talked about the Sannin generally in my Sannin versus Akatsuki video, so I highly recommend you check that out if you want me to like look at the Sannin generally speaking. So I'm gonna dive into a lot of like the different stuff that's maybe not really talked about it for Orochimaru. Now, Orochimaru is, at least in my opinion, displayed as the most impressive member of the Sannin trio, with him being the closest to Hiruzen in strength, arguably on the same level depending on your interpretation of some things, to the point that Hiruzen actually doubts that he could beat Orochimaru. And keep in mind that he's actually basing this off of like Orochimaru, like when he left the village. He just has no idea how strong Orochimaru would have been or how many jutsu he's gathered, all that stuff. Orochimaru is an absolute demon when you actually look at his abilities. He has all 5 nature releases along with yin and yang release. For some perspective on how impressive this is, they quite literally looked at Hiruzen's data book, copy and pasted the stats with all 5 nature releases, yin and yang release, and pasted it on Orochimaru. And obviously I don't need to speak on Hiruzen knowing all existing jutsu in Konoha. The same Hiruzen noting that all of his knowledge was nothing in comparison to Orochimaru's genius. Now, I'm not going to go into every nook and cranny, as there's a lot of that saved for the discussion itself, but I do want to go over some minor scaling points for Orochimaru and just discuss some things. Probably one of the bigger misconceptions I see is like Hiruzen versus Orochimaru. Now, a lot of people make a lot of vast generalizations during this fight, with the two just being relative. Some derive this off the first fanbook statement where it says, quote, "The two shinobi were equally matched. The battle seemed endless," end quote. Which, if you do subscribe to this, already paints him in a phenomenal light, especially if you think Hiruzen's ridiculously impressive. I will say, though, there are quite a bit of mental inflictions going on for both combatants. Evidence with Orochimaru stabbing his own hand to stop the emotions coming through at taking down his own teacher, you know, displayed with him beginning to cry. You can also look at his actual approach to the fight itself, with Orochimaru actually not even directly engaging Hiruzen that much during the fight. He actually utilizes the Edo Tensei, and there was a part of this where he does this for like the psychological effect of taking down Hiruzen with the former Kage. However, one could look at it as a way to indirectly take down his teacher without having to directly fight him himself, which, if you actually go back and look at the fight, Orochimaru is he's not very active during it. He only is active towards like the ending stages of the fight. Hiruzen only really just like objectively going above Orochimaru when he kind of gets that resolve to die and protect the Leaf Amp that's like talked about with Naruto as well in this arc. So when you kind of look at it like that, it actually might not just be a stretch to say like Orochimaru just may be more comparable to Hiruzen at this point, or even potentially greater. And listen, Hiruzen, if he was just a little more prime, would have just objectively been a whole tier above Orochimaru, or would have just like won the whole like Reaper Dead Seal clash. So again, it's not a dig at Hiruzen. Hiruzen literally is like dwindling his life force just by using shadow clones at this point. I don't think people quite understand how the age thing affected Hiruzen as a combatant. And I'll say this, like if you want like a 1-to-1, you can literally look at him when he's brought back as an Edo and as an old man. Jubito's literally accelerating at him. He uses a truth-seeking sphere that moves forward on top of his bodily movements accelerating. So there's like 2 layers of acceleration. And Hiruzen could still like mitigate the damage and like move away from it to a decent degree. His arm still gets tagged off, but it's like this guy is only being held back by his age. Like, so it's not necessarily a power thing, more so an arsenal thing. So that's a little bit of like Hiruzen versus Orochimaru. I definitely think you could flip it a couple ways depending on like who you think is like nerfed more. Because Hiruzen also does have issues with killing his own student as well. This is something he has to resolve himself with. A full power Orochimaru would also scale just directly above Hebi Sasuke, who attributes his victory over Orochimaru to Orochimaru being sick. And by the way, like, kind of like an interesting feat nobody brings up is the fact even Orochimaru, while on his deathbed, can just blatantly react to surprise Chidori attacks from Sasuke, like behind a door, and he doesn't even recognize the change in form. It's just completely off guard. He's like mid-cough, so he's able to block it. And on top of this, he's actually able to leave his host body while Curse Mark Stage 1 Sasuke goes for like a blitz on his head, and he's able to separate in time. This being really impressive because from the moment Sasuke gets on the bed, like, he's still pinned on the wall due to his Chidori spear. So it's like he's performing this feat while Sasuke's like right in front of him. The thing that nobody brings up about the like white snake, Orochimaru's true form, is that it actually does press Sasuke to use Curse Mark stage 2. Like the minute Sasuke starts this whole encounter with Curse Mark stage 1, he sees the white snake, like instantly cuts off some of the snakes and just goes into Curse Mark stage 2. He's not playing with it. It's very threatening to him, obviously. And even though he just completely cuts down the white snake, like he severs it multiple times, Orochimaru just regens it. You know what I'm saying? Like with no issues at all. Which just further cements like how ridiculous a full power Orochimaru would really be. If you want to say heavy Sasuke over sick Orochimaru, like the one that fought Four Tails Naruto, I think that's a fair enough take. I just think full power Orochimaru is like a different conversation. I think the earliest Sasuke that can kind of be introduced to that point is like Kage Summit Sasuke. This falls in line with a statement from Suigetsu that he, Jugo, and Sasuke had just surpassed their predecessors, with people linking this to either early 5 Kage Summit Sasuke or early EMS Sasuke. I think the 5 Kage Summit interpretation is the only reasonable one, since that was the last time Suigetsu saw Sasuke's abilities. And it doesn't really matter since Suigetsu has a very limited idea on what Orochimaru is capable of. If you want to like bolster this, it's evidenced by the fact that the minute Orochimaru comes back, Suigetsu's unbelievably fearful of him when he returns along with Sasuke. And Sasuke even chides Suigetsu for how much he's underestimating Orochimaru and how there are some things only Orochimaru can do. So Sasuke, for example, more so begins to like rival a full power Orochimaru, like approaches that level. You could say like enters the conversation when he like obtains his Mangekyo, is getting the hatred amps, like all these things. There's quite a bit more to Orochimaru, like for example his chakra and how unbelievably strong it is, and like how it amps somebody of like Kabuto's tier and how much of a hold it can increase on the Edo Tensei. But again, right, I could go on all day, so I'd rather introduce more points when they become relevant in the video. So let's get started. Now, starting off, I actually do want to talk about the Leaf Village versus the other villages. There is quite a difference between the Leaf Village and the other villages. There's actually quite a few statements, whether in part 1 or part 2, that just tout the Leaf as the strongest of the 5 hidden villages, which does give us some perspective on how the other villages would do. Now, for the sake of discussion, I'm just going to keep like the force that attacked the Leaf, even though there is some Sand Shinobi in. Otherwise, we really have no metric to judge how some of the other villages would do, so just keep that in mind. I say let's start off with the Mist Village. The Mist Village actually has a military power of 2 out of 5 at the beginning of, or like midway through Shippuden. And for some perspective, right, the Leaf Village in part 1 is when the Leaf is like touted as the strongest, or when the Leaf's complete. If you actually like compare it to when the Leaf's destroyed, even though everybody's brought back, they did lose a lot of resources in the pain attack. They actually share the same military power as the Mist. So you're kind of comparing like some of these other villages that have just lower military power as a village that just got destroyed. Now, getting into an Orochimaru versus Mei scenario, I'm going to be brutally honest. I think he just absolutely demolishes her. There's no real way for Mei, on top of like her arguably not really being able to attack him, which I do think is a debatable point. I don't think the speed aspect is as relevant for Orochimaru in a lot of these matchups. I'm going to talk about why, but you know, all this great stuff he has, Oral Rebirth. He can also use the Leech of All Creation. That's where he actually like hides inside the environment. So he can hide in the ground, hide in trees. That's why he's doing the weird stuff in the Chunin exams. Yeah, Shadow Clone's like the one he uses against Anko in the forest. Really, you have to argue like, okay, even though her lava style is especially potent, is it really going to just be like permanently putting down Orochimaru even if it hits? Probably not. The only metric I see, or like way people try and use to like downplay Orochimaru, is like Katsuyu, like him telling Katsuyu, oh, you can hit me with your acid if you think I'm lying. And A, Orochimaru doesn't care about Katsuyu. He 100% knows what she's capable of. And B, right, this is 100% Orochimaru capping, because we literally see part 1, Katsuyu's acid isn't even like breaching or melting a rock. Is Orochimaru large rock level? I don't think so. I don't think he's that weak from the acid. So there really isn't a great way for her to put him down. It's really just lava style. Water style obviously is not going to be something too crazy. He can honestly just rush her down with the grass longsword. He can also just go bar for bar with her on these jutsu clashes. When she uses water, he uses earth. It's just there's so much he can really do. He really is just ready for every situation and should scale to a comparable degree. And listen, I'm not trying to like downplay Mei. Yeah, her jutsu's potent, but like it doesn't really work against Orochimaru. All he really has to do is Oral Rebirth or just dodge it. And he has all these ways to circumvent it. In a closed arena, I don't even think Edo Tensei is entirely necessary. Probably one of like the best ways I could argue for Mei, if I was going to be like really on the Mei side, is that because it's an enclosed area, she actually does use her Vapor style to like passively corrode Orochimaru, like the same way Sasuke Susanoo was getting melted, he was getting burnt. That's probably one of the better ways, so that wherever he's reappearing, he's just getting burned down, which creates this kind of loop to where even if Aura Rebirth happens, you know, he would get continuously burned. But again, right, and the reason I mentioned Leech of All Creation is because he could literally just hide inside like the ground or wherever like they're fighting and just like come up from underneath. Like, this dude's insane. So it's kind of like a Hail Mary, and even then, like, Orochimaru would probably be able to like fight while passively getting burned too, just due to like the nature of his arsenal. So I think Mei does get kind of body bagged by Orochimaru. It's not really a dig at her. I just think Orochimaru's a lot more impressive. I also think her village doesn't do really well either, as they don't really have a Jinchuriki to aid them against like this large scale threat. The Three Tails is kind of just mucking about at this point. Chodoro at this point wouldn't even be at the level he was during the 5 Kage Summit or Shippuden. And the thing with Chodoro is that Chodoro's strength directly depends on his confidence level. Like, it just fluctuates depending on how confident he is. He's either like garbage who like fears somebody who beat Zabuza, like part 1 Zabuza of all people, or just like fluctuates to somebody who's like impressing KCM Naruto. So Chodoro's strength is very much based on confidence. You'd have to argue that. And even then, like, I think the fight against Mei just is very short-lived. I think you'd have to be really disingenuous to Orochimaru to really pull off a win for her. Ao obviously doesn't do anything. The Mist is really the most difficult one, too, because this is the village that has had, like, the most internal, like, problems. Even if you want to look with the Kaguya gland and all this crazy stuff, or just like how they were being manipulated by the Akatsuki, or the way like they structured their Chunin exams with like all the Genin class like killing each other. This is the village that has had all this like internal craziness. Probably one of the best ways for the Hidden Mist to actually take a W is to just flood the area with mist and fight specifically in mist. If you imply that a bunch of shinobi can perform a silent killing akin to Zabuza, that might give them a bit of an edge. But again, right, like their military is so low, they haven't displayed anything. Like, it's not like the Leaf where they have these juggernauts like Kakashi, Guy, like all these hard hitters, a bunch of Jonin. They have Jiraiya, like another Sannin, pull up in the village, which nobody brought up. Jiraiya literally pulls up to help the Leaf village, and they still don't just wash the Sounded Sand Forces. So it's like, it's pretty ridiculous what the Leaf had. So yeah, I think the Mist kind of gets swept under the rug. Now that one was kind of a wash, not gonna lie. Not too happy about it. We kind of all had to listen to that. I'm sorry. So we'll go with something a little more spicy this time. We're going to go with the Hidden Cloud. Now, the Hidden Cloud would definitely do better than pretty much all the other villages against the forces that Orochimaru is employing against the village, due to them having a 5 out of 5 in military ranking. And we know this since the Hidden Cloud is like always in like a state of like armament. You even see this in the last, like, peace has been established and the Hidden Cloud just made a weapon, a literal chakra laser to just blow up large scale objects. So it's like the Hidden Cloud's always grinding. They're always maxing this stuff out. They're forcing their Jinchuriki to train. They're playing this very practical. So they would do a lot better. Now, going into like Orochimaru versus the Raikage, this is a pretty deep discussion, because a lot of people are going to look at this matchup and be like, oh yeah, Raikage, speed blitz, GG. And that, so my issue with a lot of Naruto fans is that, and I talk about this in a different video that's probably going to drop soon, but I think a lot of people vastly overestimate the speed gap between a lot of characters. I think it's actually kind of ridiculous how much they paint like the speed disparity. I think a lot of characters in the series are a lot closer in speed than maybe some people would lead you to believe. Now for the Raikage, right? The only version of the Raikage that can actually be argued to be faster than Orochimaru is the Raikage going max speed with body flicker, because V1 Raikage is being reacted to Sasuke, right? There's no issues with that. He's combating that. And we don't really see V2 Raikage against Sasuke because he used body flicker. But we do see that Sasuke is still able to track the Raikage while he's just like using the guillotine drop and like doing like that hammer kick down on Sasuke. So obviously the Sasuke can perceive those levels of speed, even if maybe he's not able to combat them as well. But the body flicker, when stacked on top, is what's able to be like so fast that Sasuke can't perceive it. So that's the only version of the Raikage where you can just say like, okay, yeah, he's probably faster than Orochimaru. Now I'm going to be honest, the Raikage actually doesn't have too much to do against Orochimaru. Like, it's literally just like lightning style taijutsu, you know what I'm saying? And we kind of see how Orochimaru reacts to this, like against the Four Tails Naruto fight. Him getting like severed in half, it's nothing. It doesn't matter to him. He's just gonna keep Aura rebirthing and stuff like that. So it's like, you have to ask yourself, at what point like, let's say the Raikage is just beating him up, right? Just like severing him in half and stuff like that. At what point is Orochimaru like, all right, I've kind of like analyzed what's happening. I'm going to start employing some jutsu to kind of mitigate what the Raikage is doing. And he does have ways to do this. If they are in a barrier, he can make the formation of 10,000 snakes and just flood the floor with snakes, making it so the Raikage can't land as confidently. Or maybe you want to say the snakes can't really breach his like armor, which I think is fair. Orochimaru also just does main wind release, which is a pretty bad matchup to Raikage's lightning armor. So it's like mid to long range. He also does have a bit of an edge in this closed space. Even if you want to say the grass longsword can't breach the Raikage's cloak because like Sasuke's Kusanagi blade, who's he touts as being like sharper or in a different class than Orochimaru's can't, that's entirely fine. It's just like Orochimaru's in the right weight class and pretty much has like nigh infinite options in this situation. And if he ever does get pressed, right, he can do a couple things. If he actually is pressed by the Raikage, which I think he will, he could summon the Edo Tensei, you know, Hashirama and Tobirama. Minato was never going to make an appearance. It was never going to work. But it would be kind of funny to see the Raikage just fight Edo Minato. Like, and the thing about Orochimaru's Edo Tensei is that they're still strong. They're still very threatening to Hiruzen, who you could also just imply like is above the Raikage. Or again, right, at least comparable to a degree, even if you think the Raikage is faster. So it's like, imagine like Orochimaru's getting like run down. He's getting severed in half. Like the Raikage is just continuously speed blitzing him down. Summons the Edo Tensei. Okay, now he has all this support. Now he has like these infinite Edo Tensei who just the Raikage has no answer for. So now the Raikage has to divvy up his attention and attempt to deal with like this long range water style, wood style, which is going to be insanely problematic for him as he'll have no way to really defend with that. And he'll just like clutter the battlefield even more, which essentially puts it in like, okay, you have 3 fighters who really you just can't take down permanently, who are either comparable or on a similar level to Hiruzen on some aspect. Hiruzen, who you could also imply is greater or comparable to the Raikage. It just turns into a really bad matchup to where like, okay, yeah, like if you say like he's speed blitzing and just tearing down all these fighters, that's fine. But at a certain point, you're just going to get extremely overwhelmed in this close space. This also is not talking about Bringer of Darkness, like if he brings those out with the Edo Tensei. So it's like, you really have to imagine like all this, like the Raikage is just not permanently going to put down Orochimaru to the point where Orochimaru can gradually get off these win conditions and just gradually add more momentum to his side. So the Edo Tensei is just going to be too much. Then if they bring out Bringer of Darkness, it's like, okay, then the Raikage can just get wrapped in wood style. Or there's like other conditions like Orochimaru potentially being able to place a curse mark on the Raikage if he does like knock him out of his lightning cloak or fatigue him to the point that he loses it entirely. The same curse mark that just straight up paralyzed like the Gear Zetsu that was fighting against the Shinobi Alliance. So he really just does have options to the point that even a battle of attrition just turns against the Raikage. Honestly, the Raikage would definitely have to try and like blitz Orochimaru over and over until he exhausts himself from using Oral Rebirth, but it just doesn't seem likely, honestly, just due to all the ridiculous things in Orochimaru's arsenal. One more niche win condition that, you know, Orochimaru could do, this is insanely out of character, and I know I'm giving Orochimaru the snake guac treatment, but I just think this is kind of cool. He actually can choose to just leave his host body and just take like his true form, that like snake form. And if he does do that and the Raikage actually does sever him, the bodily fluids of the Great Serpent will just evaporate into the closed space and will have like a numbing effect to the point that it would just paralyze the Raikage. And the reason this is so effective is because it works on Sasuke, who has every known poison resistance, like notoriously known for being resistant to poisons, to the point that like even in Sasuke Retsuden, Sakura is even surprised there's like a poison that exists that he's not immune to. You could even actually look at the first fan book statement, with Orochimaru stated to be the most powerful and evil of all village enemies. So if you actually look at that, right, that he's the most dangerous and powerful of all the village enemies, this actually would mean that he was also a threat to the Cloud Village, which, you know, it's also talked about that like Orochimaru was being known by like other villages and stuff like that, so this does make sense, which would further be a source of like motivation or intent for the Raikage to train to surpass him. So you could even make some implications that Orochimaru might have been a benchmark for the Raikage in some aspects due to this statement. So I would probably say Orochimaru would definitely take this one high diff, but I definitely think Orochimaru has a better chance here. Now the Hidden Cloud's forces would definitely do a lot better against Orochimaru's forces, because in this situation they'd obviously have like a much stronger military at this point. I don't know if I would necessarily say it's on the same level as the Leafs, but it definitely would be a lot stronger than all the other villages, which would definitely add to like a potential lose for Orochimaru in this case, or like his forces. An interesting note about B in this situation, I actually don't think B is that relevant, because at this point in this series, the Raikage had tasked me to go like practice and just master his tail beast chakra. So it's like, you know, obviously, like, he would protect the village long range with his Bijou bombs. He's obviously not going to nuke his own village. So there actually is a chance that B would just be in the Storm Cloud Ravine, just training, like he does when Team Taka pulls up on him. But if he is, I mean, he's just going to be forced to go version 1 and version 2 against the enemies. He wouldn't really be able to go full 8 tails. Something that interesting that I think would be noting is, like, for whatever reason, if he did see the Raikage was like losing against Orochimaru in the barrier, he could go full 8 tails and just try to punch it as opposed to nuking it. It might be a little questionable if he actually could just break through it. We saw with the flame formation barrier, which is like a low chakra Chia technique, that he couldn't outright do it. But again, right, that it's a like weird, it's a weird comparison. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no real way to just objectively say, oh, it's gonna, you know, it'll work or it won't work. I will say though, Hiruzen did see the barrier and didn't even try to escape, but you could also chalk that up to him being like, okay, maybe it's just better if I deal with here like Orochimaru like 1v1. You know what I'm saying? Not really have to deal with him in any regard. I'll also add too that something Orochimaru could do against any of the Kage in this video is place a curse mark on them. And he does this against Girigiri Zetsu, which is like the Zetsu that was like stopping the Shinobi Alliance and stuff like that. But he can just do it. He can just randomly place paralyzing curse marks, which if he actually does do, no one's really going to be able to just big bolo their way through that. Or it would definitely take them a bit of time to just like power through it, which most probably don't really have that ability. So that's also innate win con. Like, Orochimaru has all these ways, all these poisons, all these jutsu in his arsenal to just really like change any situation to an advantageous position. He's in the perfect tax bracket. I would probably say that Orochimaru and his forces probably take an extremely high diff here in both situations, but the problem is also is that like if Orochimaru just leaves, you know, and actually does beat A, he can just go on and fight the rest with his forces and stuff like that, which may turn into Orochimaru versus Killer B. Listen, I mean, I love Orochimaru. He's not beating a complete 8 tails Killer B. That's obviously pretty insane to argue. It would just kind of be one of those situations to where Orochimaru would probably retreat at that point if his forces were probably so depleted. So, and then like as they're retreating, or like B would nuke them long range, like kind of in character. But yeah, I think that the Cloud Village is probably like a pretty high diff scenario. Probably 9 out of 10, like to 10 out of 10. Next up, we have the Hidden Sand, and with a military power of 2 out of 5 in Shippuden. And I'm gonna be honest, I think the Hidden Sand gets demolished, man. Oh my gosh, it's gonna be really bad. I mean, look. So there's a couple interesting points I want to talk about with like Orochimaru versus Rasa. The number one thing is that, you know, it's like displayed in the anime that like Orochimaru just like jams a sword through Rasa's, you know, chest. In the manga, they just find Rasa's body, but both Rasa and Hiruzen's deaths are both categorized as like assassinations, which you could maybe infer to like, okay, if there's similar situations or they just both fit that criteria, maybe a fight could have ensued there. What's more interesting though is that if you follow the conversation between Orochimaru and Hiruzen, Hiruzen actually makes like somewhat of a pseudo comparison between himself and Rasa. He's pretty much trying to negotiate with Orochimaru, who he thinks is Rasa. Orochimaru reveals himself, and Hiruzen's direct response to seeing that Orochimaru had like killed Rasa and impersonated him was, "My head won't come off as easily," giving the implication that Hiruzen would just be above Rasa or would perform far better than him, or doesn't think Rasa is as close to him in strength, which I find fascinating, as again, that just goes hand in hand with Hiruzen's lore as having a reputation of being the strongest of the 5 Kage. And the interesting thing about Kabuto making that statement is because he doesn't really see the fight between Orochimaru and Hiruzen, or we don't know like the last time he's seen Hiruzen aside from like the Chunin exams when he doesn't do anything. But him pressing Orochimaru is him living up to the reputation. So if you kind of go off this, there is a pretty good precedent to suggest Orochimaru would just be above Rasa off this. Rasa's scaling is also definitely more iffy. I'll put it like this, right? Because I don't want to get into like the Gaara sand speed, but I will say I'm under the opinion it doesn't scale to like body flicker V2A. I talk about that in a video that's going up very soon, so I won't spend too much time on it here, but I'm under that opinion. If you want to say it scales to like V1 or V2, I think that's also fine. I just think Orochimaru would scale in a similar position, just especially if you go off the Tsunade. So, again, like, the sand shouldn't just be blitzing him. And the problem here, right, is that Rasa's gold sand really just has to, like, seal Orochimaru, or that's it. Like, he really just... Defensively, it doesn't really matter since Orochimaru can do all this nutty stuff anyway, like I previously explained. He's going to rush him down. He's really just forced to, like, grab Orochimaru. And then, again, if Orochimaru's head is still out, he can just Oral Rebirth out of it. So, it's like... Orochimaru just really isn't that pressed by the sand. Like, that pretty much Rasa has to try and seal him. And we haven't really seen Rasa exhibit any sealing ninjutsu. It's like a burial similar to Gaara. The best way I would see it is that Rasa actually just does slow down Orochimaru progressively using the Iron Sand. as you know, it does have a lot more weight with the gold dust, and the data book kind of implies this to the point where he just tries to render your movement null. So that's probably one of the best ways. But then, right, literally Orochimaru just aura rebirths and like drops his body and then does all this stuff again. So it's like Ross's really only win con is just sealing or nothing, or just like progressively slowing down Orochimaru, and Orochimaru could just literally, you know, drop the whatever body's being held down. It also is questionable if Rasa could just make the gold dust on top of a building, as in the fourth Great Ninja War, he actually used the sand on the ground to transform it into gold dust, as well as like the main function of the technique being to counteract Shikaku's large-scale sand attacks. However, it does paint an interesting scenario, since you could then maybe say Rasa could use this sand outside the barrier and attempt to encompass the entire barrier itself, which would be kind of interesting. But again, right, it's like, okay, if he doesn't have it inside, he's kind of cooked. So potential negative for Rasa in that situation. Rasa would probably just use the sand on the ground and shoot it up through the building they're fighting on and get it into the barrier that way, as just a way to explain him having it if you don't think he can make it by himself. The sand also shouldn't have too many notable shinobi. There's like Baki, who's stated to be one of the top Jonin. Gaara, who's also a Jinchuriki, so there's not really too much. The sand at this point kind of was forced to work with the sound because individually neither could take down the leaves, so maybe you can imply they have relative forces. But I will say Orochimaru's side does have these giant snake summons that would probably be more difficult for the sound to deal with. You'd also have players like Kabuto engaging in the battle, so there's no reason to suggest that the Sand Village would really do that great against Orochimaru's forces. The Sand Village generally shouldn't have too much. Even their specialty would just be wind style ninjutsu. Doesn't really afford them any advantages here because it's like they're in a desert. They're not really going to be able to utilize all the sand like a Kazekage would. And unlike maybe the mist or something you want to say for the cloud, they wouldn't really have like those village-wide jutsu that's known by everybody that would be kind of effective in employing some maneuver. It just doesn't seem likely. I mean, if you want a good example, Deidara literally after defeating Gaara was kind of just able to stroll out the village. Like, yeah, he was in the air, but he still did kind of just stroll out the village. I don't know. So I just personally cannot see the Sand Village doing that well either. Next up, we have the Hidden Stone Village with a military might of 2 out of 5. Now, the Hidden Stone actually does have some advantages, kind of similar to the Mist, where you could argue the terrain actually does aid them in the jutsu they're able to use, which maybe you could imply would allow them to do a bit better. Obviously, you know, Earth-style shinobi, Village of Stone, I don't think that one requires too much explanation. So despite having a 2 out of 5 on the military power, the terrain itself actually does afford them some pretty big advantages. Now, starting off, we have to talk about Onoki versus Orochimaru. Now, from a speed perspective, Onoki actually also comes in a bit confident against Orochimaru, just due to the fact that he's reacting on par with the Raikage, constantly making him faster and heavier, timing the weighted boulder jutsu to when the Raikage strikes against Madara, so he obviously would need some level of relativity there. Looking past that, Madara also just blatantly paints Onoki as the biggest issue among the 5 Kage, and this is the same dude who left his 5v1 to go help the other Kage because he just could make the Susanoo clones heavy due to the weighted boulder jutsu. Now, against Orochimaru, you know, particle style versus Orochimaru. That's kind of the discussion, because weighted boulder doesn't really matter because Orochimaru can aura rebirth whatever body is like weighted down and just pull himself out of it, or just like shoot out his mouth and stuff like that. And Onoki could always make himself lighter, but realistically, and it's kind of simpler to say, Orochimaru doesn't have a counter to particle style. He literally just gets, unless he gets torn in half, but if Onoki actually does make it big enough to where it can just encompass Orochimaru's entire body, which, again, we've seen, and it isn't that hard to do, I mean, he can't really do anything about it. It's just, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like, I wish I could say there's more, but it's just like, okay, do you think Onoki's fast enough to get off particle style? You may base this off Mu and his, like, claim that his particle style is faster than KCM Naruto, with Onoki matching that. But again, right, it almost doesn't really matter, because at this point too, you could actually make a case Onoki would just be able to shred through the barrier with particle style. Like, if he just shoots it, it would just like cut right through the barrier. And if we're really going to argue this, particle style, and by a bit of Tsunade's chakra, one shot 25 wood Susanoo clones. So it's like, obviously he's not going to be performing that, but I do think there is a bit of a case to be made that Onoki would just body the barrier, and he has the speed necessary to just take down Orochimaru with particle style. Even if he just like weighted boulders him for a second, that's all he really needs. Other than that, though, if he doesn't really get this win con, it kind of cuts both ways, because all Orochimaru really has to do is like take him down with the grass longsword, place a seal on him, or just using some other option, take out Onoki. So it's actually a bit of a battle to where like Orochimaru doesn't have any margin for error. It's kind of more so on Onoki to just mess up. I'll also say this, or the reason I'm not bringing up like Onoki's or the rest of his arsenal, they're just not as relevant in this discussion. Honestly, Jinton is all he really needs, and he doesn't even have to stop using it once he hits Orochimaru. He can just shred the barrier and just turn him, like, go help the village. And I'll say this too, if Onoki gets outside the barrier, he's just going to fly around and shoot Jinton. Obviously, he's not going to be able to do it crazy because like, he can only do it once or twice against Mu before he needs time to like recuperate his chakra supplies. But like, that's still pretty crazy. The minute Onoki gets out, he's going to be flying and it's just going to be too much for Orochimaru. So he might have to retreat, or they kind of go into like the village forces and just scrap up there. Now, I know we talked about the Hidden Stone Village as well. They really, we mentioned they have Kurotsuchi, they have Kitsuchi. They do have some pretty decent shinobi, but I will say, the Hidden Stone probably has to rely a bit more on its Jinchuriki since they have Han and Roshi. Neither are really noted to be perfect Jinchuriki, but I mean, still like an out of prime Roshi with like lava style coating his entire body would still be pretty threatening to the rest of the village. Same thing with Roshi, with just like the max or pinnacle of taijutsu in the series, or like the top of it. They would be very useful in this village encounter. The fact that at least Roshi can compartmentalize his Bijuu's power, at least by the anime standards, also does help out a lot, to the point that, obviously they don't have to like make a deal with their Biju or just lose control or anything like that. Because again, right, it's not like these guys really have, they're more so on that exchanging chakra for chakra type basis that B was describing, as opposed to just being on good terms with their Biju. So the Hidden Stone, you could actually make a decent case, would actually do quite well. And I will say, if Onoki actually does take out Oro, which there is a pretty decent chance, I might say 6 times out of 10, just due to the fact that he really just needs one good particle style to permanently take down Orochimaru. But if he actually does miss and can't keep using them and runs out of chakra, then it's clipped for him, and Orochimaru's just going to take a pretty easy W against him there. So it's kind of like an all or nothing. Which do you favor, Onoki's feats in the War Arc, or Orochimaru scaling to Hiruzen, who you can make a valid assertion is over Onoki? I can't really make an objective case, kind of up to you and your interpretation of a couple things, but I do think this one is close enough to where there is a bit of debate to be had. So I would say the Hidden Stone would probably do a lot better, again, with the environmental advantages along with Onoki. Orochimaru is definitely going to need the Edo Tensei in this situation to try and draw Onoki off of him. So again, right, you kind of have to argue if Orochimaru gets that momentum, or if Onoki just takes him out off rip. But if Orochimaru can just do that, I mean, he will just have a pretty easy time. It's just kind of like, again, particle style or nothing. So, Orochimaru will have his hands full with the Hidden Stone, but if you want to rank like difficulty, I guess I'll start with the Cloud, then it goes to Stone, then it goes to Mist, and then it goes to Sand. So that's how I'd probably rank them. Let me know your guys' thoughts. I know this was a bit of a different video. I didn't want to go anything too crazy, just more of a fun discussion, obviously. I know there's certain points that kind of glossed over, like the Kage potentially being stronger or weaker from the time skip to the point that I'm comparing them to. There was obviously a couple things, but again, just more of a chill discussion. Let me know your guys' thoughts down below if you enjoyed the video, why, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.